Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Shuchandra Ghosh, Professor, Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture, University of Calcutta. The topic today is Indian culture and the paper is Social and Cultural History of India. I'll be talking on food and beverages in early India. Now, why do we study food and beverages? Because for everyday life or for understanding the everyday life of the people, it is important to know about their food habits and drinking preferences. So when we are doing social history, that it is important that we also learn about the food habits. In this module, what I will try to give you is an idea of the different kinds of sources and which talks about food and beverages that were used in different periods of history. Why do we study food? The essentiality of food for sustenance of life is known from prehistoric times. We cannot sustain without food. Now, food being recognized as an important for life, primitive man had been in search for eatables and adapted progressively through centuries to a wide range of naturally occurring foods. We all know that early men procured their foods with hunting and gathering. So they were known as hunter-gatherers. With the advent of agriculture and with the development of the ability to produce and store food, profound changes were noted in the food habit as some food items could be preferentially cultivated and procured. The health benefit of the increased and assured food supply was also reflected in the elimination of starvation. But food is not just a mere edible, and eating is not only a biological process of consumption. Food is also integral, a part of our cultural history. The importance of food as an essential need for keeping the body and mind and soul is well known. If we look at the Chandogya Upanishad, we find that food is defined as, I quote, that which enables to use all faculties, which means food is actually the petrol of our life. Without food, we cannot sustain. Purity of thoughts is dependent on purity of food. Purity of thought leads to good memory, and when memory does not fail, all the knots which bind the man to this world are loosened. We have different sources for understanding the nature of the food and beverages. So we will start with mostly the textual sources, and we find that different religious texts like the Jaina and the Buddhist literature laid down strict rules as to what should be eaten. Kautilya's Arthashastra also referred to food requirements of people. Then we have the epics and Puranic literature, which makes their heroes like Bhima and Nala as experts in the art of cooking. The idea of feasting is very much there in the epic or Puranic literature. Moreover, no definite single treatise, especially on the art of cooking, appears to have existed before the 14th century CE. So what we do is, when there is no single treatise, we look at different texts and try to understand from these texts, get the descriptions and see what kind of foods and beverages people were used to having in those period of time. The second most important fact about food habits is understanding the landscape, the geography. It must have originated primarily in relation to the food materials available locally due to climatic and ecological conditions. For example, people around the sea coast would have had coconut and sea fish in plenty. So our geography conditions our liking or preference for a food. In Bengal or in Eastern India, rice is a plenty, so rice is our main food. However, when trade and movement of people started flourishing, food habits also had spread and got mixed up in different regions in India. So therefore, we have, sitting in Bengal, we have foods from South India. Sitting in Amritsar, one will have food from Eastern India. So therefore, geography precluding, we are always trying to have foods from different parts of the country. Religion also played a dominant part in prescribing what to eat and what not to eat. That we will see in some of the texts. Now to begin with, we are talking about the Vedic corpus. In this section, I will talk about the Vedic corpus and the Sutra literature. I need not go into the definition of the Vedic corpus. You all are aware of the different kinds of Vedas. Along with the Vedas, the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas and the Upanishads. What we find is that in the Rig Veda, people consumed barley, milk, curds, clarified butter, mutton and beef. Later on, rice and many varieties of pulses were included in their diet. But when there is a shift from the northwest to the Ganga valley in the later Vedic period, we find that rice became also an integral part of their diet, and it was customary to kill a big ox or a big goat to feed a distinguished guest. We had sacrifices, and these animals were actually killed in sacrifices. Honey was possibly the earliest of the sweets Indians knew, and we shall see that it continued to be a very important sweet. A pupa, a round cake of barley baked in clarified butter on slow fire, was also very common in the Vedic corpus, both in the early Vedic and the Rig Vedic. Now moving on to the Sutra period, we find that rice becomes very common. As I mentioned that as we moved towards the Ganga plains, we had plenty of rice. Boiled rice was taken with curds, honey, meat and milk. Preparations mixed with ghee seems to have been, that is clarified butter, seems to have been greatly relished. Meat was commonly eaten, and flesh of various birds is prescribed even for a child. In this period, the notion of clean and unclean meat was well developed. Honey with curds or ghee was very much used for welcoming guests, and we have different categories of sweets. For example, there is an interesting sweet called swastika. Modaka was very common, and it's common even till today. We have Nandyavarta also mentioned as a kind of a sweet in the Sutra literature. Now from the Vedic corpus and the Sutra, when we move into the Jain and the Buddhist texts, we will see that there is some kind of a little bit of change. For example, the Jainas had dietary prohibitions. And why? Because we all know that non-slaughter of animals, destruction of any living being was very integral to Jainism. So to minimize the destruction of any living beings was greater than that of any other religion of the subcontinent. So not only were meat, fish and eggs forbidden in the Jaina texts, but also all those vegetables and fruits whose consumption involved any potential violence. Thus, roots, bulbs and tubers, which had to be wrenched forcibly from the ground and which naturally caused injury to worms and insects. Fruits and vegetables with numerous small seeds, unboiled or unfiltered water which was teeming with countless minute life forms, and honey were on the catalogue of forbidden foods. Buddha was, however, not so strict. When we look at the Buddhist texts, we know that there was no such thing called purity, looking at purity which comes through food. Meat and fish were invariably included in the diet. We know that Buddha condemned animal sacrifice, but he did not insist on his followers to become vegetarian. But one important thing which the followers of Buddha kept in mind was that they were not allowed to kill any animal only for food. But meat of wild animals could be cooked in times of distress or in some extraordinary circumstances, or if someone is ill, because meat soup was very much argued as a very good item for nourishment. Then in the Buddhist texts, there are a lot of evidence of different kinds of sweets. So we have sweet fried rice, which is called madhulaja, sweet balls, madhugolaka, which were very common in use, apart from the anupa and other things. Now, there is a different kinds of texts, like the medicinal texts, the charakas and the Sushruta texts, which gives us a very pertinent idea of the kind of foods which will be good for or beneficial to a person. So we find that among the beneficial food items, repeated mention is of shali rice. Now shali was a very common food rice both in Western India and Eastern India. We have inscriptions from Western India, the inscriptions of the Shilaharas, which talk about the plenty of shali rice. This rice is sweet, light and easily digested. It promotes strength, pacifies pitta, but slightly increases vata and kapha. These are the terms that we find in Ayurveda, we find in the medical texts. Lohitaka, that is red, is adjudged as there are different colors of rice. So Lohitaka is the red rice as the best variety of shali rice because it is elevating, diuretic and wholesome for eyes and voice promoter of complexion, pacifier of thirst and eliminates all diseases. Then we have for the lentils, we have the mugda, which is moog now, and masurika are recommended for being superior among the pulses. Masurika is the masur dal, the yellow lentil, and Bengal gram pacifies kapha and rakta pitta and is an excellent pacifier of vata when mixed with ghee. So these kind of lentils were prescribed in the Charaka and Shusruta. Now we move on to the next phase, which is the phase of the Mauryans and the post-Mauryans. But one thing I must tell you, the Charaka and the Shusruta fell into the post-Mauryan period. But since it's a separate kind of text, so we have used them separately. Now when we look at the Mauryan period, we have, it is an all pan-Indian scenario, but we see that some new features could be seen in the food habit of this period. For example, in the Sutra literature, we have mention of only 2 crops, but Kautilya's Arthashastra mentions a third, and which consists of pulses. For this period, our main source is the Arthashastra. We also use a little bit of Megasthenes' Indica. Ashoka's inscriptions help us in understanding the nature of food that was preferred by the ruler. Now some new seasoning were also seen in the Arthashastra. For example, new spices, coriander, cardamom, cloves were used. If we look at the rock edicts of Ashoka, we see that thousands of living creatures were killed, and he says that now he will issue restriction. So these thousands were cut down to 2 or 5, like that. So therefore there was restriction in the killing of animals. So we have this idea in Ashoka, non-slaughter of anarambha prananam, non-slaughter of animals. Honey and sugarcane was very popular like in earlier times, and if we read Megasthenes' Indica, we find that he talks highly of sugar. Now moving to the post-Mauryan period, that is after the downfall and disintegration of the Mauryan Empire, we find that there are different kinds of kingdoms which came into the forefront. We find that there was a revival of Ashwamedha sacrifice because these small powers were trying to establish themselves as big ruling houses. For example, Pushyamitra Sunga is said to have performed Ashwamedha sacrifice. And when we have sacrifices, we know that animals were being killed. So this actually indicates consumption of meat. Many new preparations are now mentioned. For example, a new preparation of rice or wheat called Vishyanda is mentioned in the Shusruta. Many sweet preparations were made from powdered wheat flour in this period. Meat was considered as a very nourishing diet, and meat soup was recommended for the weak. Old preparations of sweets were made, and more additions of new additions were also found with new ingredients like coconut were added to some sweets, which obviously made it very tasty. From the post-Maurya, moving into the Gupta period. That is, we know that the Gupta era starts from 319 or 320 CE. In this period, we find variety of rice there were number of rice variety and it was greatly improved. Milk rice was popular, but some Brahmanas like the Vidushika in the Mritshakatika we find was very fond of rice with curds. The old preparations of rice continued with a new one which was known as Utkarika. This is a very important phenomenon that the old continues and we will see it throughout. This Utkarika was prepared with rice flour and milk and clarified butter of a goat with some medicines. Of all the pulses, as mentioned above, Mudga was very important and especially the green variety was considered the best. We have reference to a preparation called Yavagu, which seems to be very popular. Meat and fish were part of diet, and literature, Kavya literature, gives description of roasted meat which was a common sight in the urban centers. Boneless meat ground after boiling and mixed with spices were also used as a stuffing, like it's a present day kind of a mutton, minced mutton. During this period, particularly in the Gupta and the post-Gupta period, we find lot of references to the feasts, like the dinner processes where the dinner activities were described. But they were mainly royal feasts. In Nala Champu, we find that Trivikrama Bhatta, 915, that's datable to 915 AD, describes the feast thrown at the time of Nala's marriage. It comprises of salyodana, sali rice, as mentioned earlier, the best form, cooked in ghee, supa, fruit, juice, vegetables cooked with spices, milk, curds, dal, modaka, gharika and ashokavarti. The author mentions only a few people of the south are meat eaters, while in north, west and east, mostly people are meat eaters. So it was a lavish spread. There are other texts also in the early medieval period which gives us an idea of the food habits or the daily foods. For example, in Yashastilaka, Yashastilaka Champu of Somadeva Suri, he gives us an idea of the daily food of the rich people of Deccan. He was a part of the Rashtrakuta kingdom, as consisting of white shining Didivi rice, broths of golden hue, butter, curries, well-cooked dainty dishes, thick curds, milk, sweets and water perfumed with camphor. In Bhavisayatakaha in the 10th century, the menu for the royal feast starts with shali rice and mudga dal with ghee. Beverage of amla fruits mixed with jaggery serves as an appetizer. Ghoria, ladduka, khajja, khaja is khaja, kheer, kasara, kapitha and suheli were served. Coconuts, grapes, mangoes, pomegranates and citrus were taken. In the end, betel leaves with camphor were also partaken. Now, it is very important when you are having a good food, there are descriptions not only in this text, but even the texts from the lower order, for example, the Charja Gitis, where you have people taking betel leaf with camphor. Now I will come to a case study. And this is from Eastern India, that is, we'll focus on Bengal. Now, there was no single entity called Bengal at that part of time. So it was divided into certain sub-regions, and so it is natural that there will be subtle differences in the methods of cooking or in the methods of preparation of some common foods. There is no doubt that the chief staple food consumed by the rich and the poor alike in their everyday life was rice. According to verse 10 of the Anulia copper plate, King Lakshmana Sena of the Sena dynasty is said to have provided many pious Brahmanas with a large number of villages which had excellent fields of shali paddy. Again, verse 24 of the Idalpur copper plate, we find that is similarly described as bestowing villages containing fields where shali paddy was grown. So here you can see that irrespective of all the regions and irrespective of the time, shali continued to be the best form of rice. From Brihadharma Purana, which is a regional Purana of Bengal, we learn that one should have at least first rice mixed with ghee, then vegetables followed by soup, etc. and lastly Rice with milk should be partaken. Salt must not be mixed with milk nor molasses with sour. There is another commentary called Tika Sarvasya by Sarvananda, who mentions the different types of fishes because Bengali people were very fond of fish. And since there are a lot of rivers, so fish became a part of their diet. Now we have references to fish like Rohita, Madgura, Shala, Shakula, etc., which were common in early Bengal. It is interesting to note that though in general dried fish were not eaten, Sarvananda informs us that the people of Bangladesh would be in present-day Bangladesh, were in his time very fond of partaking cooked dried fish, which perhaps was the trait of a coastal society. And that one has to always remember that the food of an inland society varied from a food of a coastal society. Now, having discussed about foods, let us concentrate on the drinks. Let us concentrate on the beverages. Drinks could be just simple drinks like water and others kind of syrups or intoxicating drinks. According to the Dharma Shastras, drinking wine was tabooed. Yet, nowhere in the world people appeared to have followed the codes and rules rigidly, particularly the kings, soldiers and working classes. We shall see that right from the time of the Vedic corpus, intoxicating drinks were part and parcel of life. Of the beverages mentioned in the Vedic texts, Shoma juice was the most important. Shoma juice was stored, it was actually favorite of Lord Shiva also, it is later on it is said, was stored in jars or wooden tubs and was either brown, ruddy or tawny in color. It was mixed with curds, clarified butter or milk to improve its taste. It was believed that it inspired, if you have Shoma juice, it inspired confidence, courage, faith and self-trust and bestowed powers of eloquence and immortality. Immortality was always desired by the people and so they preferred Shoma juice. But there was this other intoxicating juice mentioned in the Vedic text and this was Shura, which was prepared from fermented barley or wild paddy after distillation. While the Soma juice was highly commended, that of Shura was condemned in the Vedic texts, Vedic corpus, because it is said that after drinking Shura, people become intoxicated and that could give rise to broils in the assembly, means in the Shabha and the Samiti of the Vedic people. Its popularity in the later Vedic period is however evident from a verse in the Atharva Veda where it is mentioned that as a reward for the performance of sacrifices, somebody will be offered Shura. The praise of Shura in the Aitariya Brahmana also is found, and we have Shura, separately Shura vessel in the hands of a king makes us conclude that the Kshatriyas were generally in the habit of drinking Shura, that is, habit of drinking intoxicating drinks. Another common intoxicating drink was Parisruta. It was prepared either from flowers or by fermenting certain grasses, while Kilala was a sweet drink prepared from cereals. We shall see later also we have reference to Parisruta. The preparation of another kind of drink called Masurais is described in the Yajurveda. It was prepared with a mixture of mess of rice and some spices which was allowed to ferment for 3 days. This beverage was purified with the help of a filter. Water is described as always as nectar, amrita, and remedy for all kind of ailments. Now moving from the Vedic corpus, if we go to the Sutra literature, we find that strong liquor was served to the guests when a person came during housewarming ceremony. So it was a kind of a welcome drink. It was served to women when a bride arrived at the bridegroom's place, and it was served to the wives of forefathers in the Anvastaka rite. Women who performed a dance at the time of marriage were also served Shura. But the evil effects of drinking were not unknown to the authors of the Dharma Sutras. They regard drinking as a heinous crime and forbid the use of liquors particularly for Brahmins and students. So this sura was present, but the normative texts did not, of course, like the use of shura. Besides shura, which was generally prepared with barley or rice flour, there were some other intoxicating drinks. Kilala, which was mentioned in the Vedic corpus also, was a sweet drink prepared from cereals. A spiced liquor called maireya, prepared with gura or sugar, had also come into use. And we will see that maireya continued as an important liquor for a long time. Wine introduced from Kapisi, north of Kabul, Kapisha region, was known as Kapisayani. Panini also refers to varieties of wine. We know that Panini was living in the northwest part of the subcontinent. Soma juice continued to be used in Srota ritual, but is not mentioned in the domestic rites. As earlier, Paristruta was also another kind of beverage, and it appears from the Gautama Dharma Sutra that the Brahmanas were prohibited from drinking any kind of intoxicating drink. Moving to the Buddhist and Jaina works, we learned that liquor was manufactured and consumed on a large scale. In the Buddhist texts, taverns and drinking shops are always mentioned, and we know that at the time of the festivals, feasting and drinking were resorted to and friends were invited. Jain sources also mention drinking. King Duvaya is said to have entertained the members of a marriage party with many kinds of liquors and wines. From the Jataka stories, we learn that even women and her maids drank hard on some occasions. To distinguish a liquor shop from another shop, there were flags. Then we find that strong liquors in the text, that strong liquors were called madhya, but the general word for all kinds of intoxicating drinks prepared from cereals is sura. The Vinaya texts mention 5 kinds of shura prepared from rice mill, from cakes, from boiled rice, from ferment and with spices. Maireya, that is spiced wine, which I mentioned earlier, seems to be very popular at this time. Varuni, a strong liquor, the wine prepared from madhuka flowers. Prashanna, variety of sura, and Sidhu, prepared with the juice of sugarcane, were other intoxicating drinks in use. In the Buddhist and Jaina works also, we have references to many syrups which were prepared from fruits. In the Jain canon, we learned that liquors prepared from palm fruit, jati flowers, kodamba fruit were also used. A strong intoxicating drink which did not lose its true nature even when diluted 100 times is called satau. The Buddha allowed 8 kinds of beverages to his followers. Sometimes syrups prepared with gura and sugar were also used. Actually, the Buddhists did not eat anything in the afternoon, so they could have these kind of drinks, the different kinds of syrups in the afternoon. Now, moving into the Mauryan period, we find that here we take recourse first to Megasthenes and also to Kautilya. And Megasthenes states that the Indians drank only at the religious ceremonies. But this does not seem to be the actual state of affairs in view of the account of Kautilya. We have reference to a superintendent of liquors. The liquor shops had many rooms provided with beds and seats and other comforts such as scents and garlands. These shops were situated and at stated intervals, and liquors was sold to persons of well-known character in small quantities. So there was a kind of a restriction. A person could not eat as much as he wanted to eat. So there was a restriction, and which could stop drunken broils. Manufacture of wine was a state monopoly like in all other cases in the Mauryan period, but on festive occasions the right of private manufacture of beer for 4 days was recognized on payment of license fees. Kautilya gives a detailed account of the method and ingredients of various other intoxicating drinks. Medaka and prasanna were manufactured from rice. In the post-Mauryan period, we have Patanjali's Mahabhashya as a very important source, and we know that Patanjali's period actually coincided with the period of Pushyamitra Sunga. So here we find that there were some people who could drink a complete jar of wine through a pipe made of reeds. Patanjali also talks about wines from grapes which were in common use. The two famous varieties, Kapisayana and Harahuraka, were imported from Afghanistan as seen earlier also. It appears from the Mahabhashya that there was a belief among the Indians that a Brahmana woman who indulged in drinking would be deprived of her husband's company in the next world. Actually, perhaps this prevented women from taking to drinks. We have many wine drinking scenes in the sculptures of Gandhara and Mathura, which shows that among the elite classes, wine drinking was very common. The bacchanalian and seals are replete with wine cups in the hands of women. Palm fruit was also used in preparing liquors according to Greek authorities. Ramayana mentions two varieties of shura, ordinary and the fermented one. Moirea seems to be the most popular drink as always. Other beverages were curds, buttermilk, fruit juices and a syrup prepared from molasses. In the Gupta period, we take recourse to Kalidasa's works and we have many references to drinking. Even the Kavya literature of the period talks a lot about drinking, but we cannot bring in all the sources here. So it was believed that intoxication gave a special charm to women. Ladies of royal families therefore enjoyed drinking. If we look at the Kama Sutra of Vatsayana, we know that a part of Nagaraka's daily ritual was also visiting these liquor shops. Police officers, soldiers, drummers and their friends are represented as enjoying themselves by drinking in the liquor shops in the different texts. The statement of the Vayu Purana that in the Kali Yuga even women would drink has probably a reference to contemporary habits, that is to the 4th century AD when it was finally redacted. Intoxicating drinks were generally prepared from grapes, sugarcane, honey and rice. Wines flavored with mango juice and patala flowers also were used. The Vayu Purana mentions an intoxicating liquor called kasya. Wines were also prepared from such fruits as Rajadana and Madanaphala and Madhuka flowers. All the varieties of liquors mentioned in the earlier period were used in this period, and the medical works also prescribed their moderate use as in the earlier works. Now in the post-Gupta or in the early medieval period, the same scenario continued. Drinking intoxicating beverage was very common among the people. If we look at Somadeva's Kathasarita Sagara, he gives an interesting account of a drinking place. In the Sukranitisara, distillation of wine is regarded as an art and moderate use of wine is recommended, which shows that there were people who were actually with the habit of drinking wine. On the occasion of marriage feasts, drinking was common. Fruit juices were also in use. Text like Manasollasho describes the preparation of a special beverage. This is very interesting. It said that it was prepared by mixing some acidic fruit juice with boiled milk. Then the liquid was separated from the solid. In the strained liquid, sugar and cardamom powder were mixed, and tamarind fruit with the juice of some other fruits were then mixed and it was drunk. So a new kind of drink was prepared. We have a beautiful description of a drinking party. According to Someshwara, we find that drinking parties usually took place in forests, lawns, gardens or on the river banks as a sort of picnic parties. Several foodstuffs including meat were served, just as in modern times, where with each round of drink, some foodstuffs are taken for munching. How the ladies booze and get intoxicated was well described by Someshwara. The king usually played the part of the host. Someshwara himself, in the middle of these descriptions, praises the drinking of wine. According to him, wine when drunk with friends increases friendship, and when drunk with relations keeps away sorrow. So from the foregoing, what do we learn? We find that the mobility of the people, the acquirement of knowledge from each other and the adaptability of the human habits to pick up what is tasty and nourishing made some food habits spread from to different parts of the country. The 30 verses of the Manusmriti devoted to meat eating situate it quite explicitly with respect to Jati Varna caste norms. Brahmanas, Manu says, may eat the meat that is consecrated in sacrifice, an act that is morally distinct from killing. Therefore, sacrificial meat was not bad for eating by any kind of groups, particularly the Brahmanas. Regional variations could be seen regarding food habits. We have also seen lavishness of royals' feast, which stood in stark contrast to the common man, what the common man ate. In general, we find that we observe continuity with some changes in food and drinking habits in early India. To learn more about the food and beverages, you can actually look at the EPG Pathshala modules, where you will find a detailed description of the different kinds of food and beverages that were used in early India. Thank you.